Identification. This is an interview with the Australian poet John Forbes. The interviewer is John Tranter. It was recorded in Studio 212 of the Australian Broadcasting Corporation's Forbes Street studios on the 6th of July 1987. The duration of this version of the interview is 55 minutes 24 seconds. The recording is mono. End of identification. A few weeks ago I asked John Forbes to come into our studios and talk about his work and to read some of the poetry from that book. I began by asking him to read the poem Europe, a Guide. John Forbes.
Greece is like a glittering city, though only in a political speech. But Italians believe in bella figura and misuse the beach. In Germany there's craft work and acres of expressionist kitsch. Oil-rich Norwegians don't need to ski, they just like it. And Iceland is famous for its past. Doing their physical jerks, a quiet pride permeates the Swedes. Denmark is neither vivid nor abrupt, and Belgians have a ringside seat to observe the behaviour of the Dutch. The French invented finesse, but it's their self-regard that intrigues us. We pity the English, though they get on our wick, pretending to understand us. And Scotland is old-fashioned like a dowry, but unusual like nice police. Mention Ireland and you've already said enough. The Spaniards are not relaxed about sex, and tourists are attracted to this. Some Portuguese exist entirely on a diet of fish, but rich cakes, finance and guest workers sustain the Swiss. Consult my by trail bike and hot air balloon through Middle Europe for details of the Austrians and Czechs. But don't forget Bavaria's Oktoberfest, or that Rococo architecture was designed to be passed out under, pissed, and it's aesthetically edifying to do this. For the rest, give Russia a miss. The Poles will appreciate hard currency, but only as a gift. And the flesh pots of Split will leave you a physical wreck. This guide stops short at the Balkans as it omits the Finns. I won't apologise. Many guides to Australia include New Zealand or leave out Tasmania. No doubt some thorough American manual can give you the lowdown on Europe's margins. But mine, designed for only one traveller, is better written and much shorter. Besides, if you remove the art, Europe's like the US, more or less a dead loss. And while convenient for walking and picturesque, like the top of a Caran d'Ache pencil case or a chocolate box, what do you make of a landscape that reminds you of itself? Is this why the people are sure they're typical, not standard? I can't advise you on this, but I know how I enjoyed myself. Though knocked out by what convinced me great art without inverted commas is, but not because of this, I hung around with other Australians and hit the piss.
John, you dedicated that poem to Ken Searle, and a lot of readers mightn't be aware that Ken Searle is a painter. It seems to me that the framework of your thinking in that whole poem is to look at Europe either as an art object in itself or as a production centre for art.
Well, not so much a production centre or as an art object, certainly as a place where there is a lot of art, produced a lot of art that we've been trained in through looking at reproductions of it and been told that it was great art.
You talk about the top of a chocolate box and the top of a Caran d'Ache pencil case as somehow exemplifying aspects of Europe.
Well, the Caran d'Ache pencil case is a very old image I have of Europe. When I was about 7 or 8 in school, I had a tin of coloured pencils that were made by Caran d'Ache, and on the top of the tin was a picture of, I imagine, Switzerland. Lots of mountains, unlike the mountains in Australia or the mountains that I'd seen. And sort of backdrop for Heidi, green grass, sheep looking plump and woolly and ready to be eaten.
Processed images of Europe, in other words.
More or less.
What part of that poem seems to be doing is deconstructing those ideas of Europe as a chocolate box tourist destination.
Well, the poem's basically comic. It's basically taking the idea of a chocolate box or a contained packaged tourist destination, taking those ideas to extremes.
What about some readers' responses that might be, this is just a kind of Barry Mackenzie way of laughing at Europe?
Well, it's meant to laugh at not so much Europe, but the assumptions about Europe a lot of people from the New World bring to Europe, or bring to their experience of Europe, namely to see it as a totality, as being somehow a richer environment, an environment more soaked in aesthetic and historical resonances, and one in which the artistic spirit or the artistic frame of mind will feel more at home, will even sort of recognise itself, rather than the experience it has in the arid, provincial, Philistine suburbs of the New World. Now, this particular structuring of our experience in relation to Europe, I think, is very pervasive at very different levels of sophistication, and I think tedious in the long run. I'm not suggesting that there isn't a lot of enjoyable things in Europe, but that's all it is. It's sort of high-grade consumerism, except for the fact that there is a lot of art that is challenging and exciting and vastly different to the reproductions of it that you've seen. I used to think that people said, oh, there's nothing like the originals, or, and they usually were, using their experience as a form of social offensiveness. Yeah. But there is a certain degree of truth in that statement.
I'm wondering now what a lot of readers will think about the last few lines where you say, like Barry Mackenzie, you hung around with a lot of other Australians and hit the piss. In other words, so much for Europe, I prefer to be with my mates and get drunk.
Well, it's more a confession of social inadequacy, I think.
A lot of readers might see it as bravado rather than inadequacy, I wonder.
Let me tell them, it wasn't a function of bravado. They were grim experiences. I would have much preferred to have been mixing with sophisticated continentals, but I didn't have the correct series of assumptions about myself or about them to bring it off.
You also need a lot of languages and a lot of money, I think.
Yes, a lot of money would be, I think, the crucial determinant there, John.
Well, you spent some time in London, and while you were there, you had a dream about Frank O'Hara. Would you like to tell me a bit more about that?
This dates back. This is very early, this poem. And this is a literal transcription of a dream. Dreams are a notorious or famous source of images for writers, or they have been for the last couple of 100 years. Well, no, longer than that. But this one, the dream had the structure that I relate, and it's not just a series of disconnected images. And it was the structure of it that attracted me to it. It's very tricky to say, this is exactly how I dreamt it or experienced it or something like that, because lo and behold, when you look at it, it turns out to have a very sort of literary construction about it. But it is, for better or worse, a dream. A dream. I'm staying in a big hotel in some city that's cold, with snow on the ground, probably London. I'm here for a poetry reading, and Frank O'Hara is staying at the same hotel, and he's at the poetry reading too. He reads some poems I've never heard or read before, and they're great, like Essay on Style or Fantasy. After the reading, I walk back to the hotel with him, discussing the poems he's read. He's dressed in an early 60s style suit and snap-brim hat. He has on a white shirt and the rest of his clothes are black. On the way back, I'm looking for an open chemist shop as I've got just enough money to buy a bottle of Actifed CC. As we walk along, we pass a few and I remember there's one in the hotel lobby. When we get there, Frank shows me some of his new poems. I'm actually looking over his shoulder because he's quite short, and I see a date at the bottom of one of his poems, 1976. I must have asked him about this because I can see him scratching his forehead, his hand pushing back his snap brim as he does so. Then he goes off to his room and I tool into the chemist's for the Actifed. I ask the price and the woman behind the counter, a superior, refined, middle-aged pommie, tells me $9.60. "'Struth," I say, "that's a lot." She looks at me haughtily and says, "Oh, you drug addicts live in a little world of your own. Haven't you heard about inflation?" "Shove it, lady," I say, and race out of the hotel, hoping to catch an open chemist. I go one way and reach one that's closed, so I double back, go past the hotel and come to one that's open. It's a very old-fashioned looking place with thin windows between carved Gothic frames. I go in and ask the chemist, an old bloke, how much is a bottle of Actifed CC? $2.50, he says. I say, I'll have 2, thanks. He gives them to me and I pay him. Before I leave, I ask him how come he sells them so cheap when down the road they cost $9.60 each. He says, they let inflation get to them. How do you avoid it, I ask. And he says, the way to beat inflation is to live in the past. I ask him what he means and he says, anyone can do it. Look at Frank O'Hara. He was still writing good poems in 1976 and he'd been dead for 10 years. It's simple. Oh, I say, baffled but knowing he's right. Nothing much happens after this.
I don't know what to say about that.
Well, it's outside the realm of rational discourse. I mean, it's full of elements that would only occur in a dream. For instance, I've never been to a poetry reading with Frank O'Hara. I'm not a drug addict. And they don't use dollars and cents in London.
The bizarre thing about it, though, is the logic that seems to be behind it. There's actually a logical argument behind it all that's explained by the line, the way to beat inflation is to live in the past. And that's a very bizarre and very witty line, in fact.
Well, I don't know. Like I say, after I woke up, I thought, wow, what a great dream. And I wrote it down, and I've kept it ever since. I've never been certain of its literary worth, but I've read it a few readings and a number of people have liked it, so I thought I'd hang on to it. Though you can give yourself a bad name by writing poems about socially unacceptable things. People think, oh, well, he wrote that poem, therefore it applies to him.
Yes. And the other thing about it being in prose too.
Yes, well, prose is the way it occurred when I wrote it down. I wrote it down more as a matter of record, to record the fact that the dream in case I forgot it, because a few years before this, I had another dream that was incredibly vivid and, to me, very interesting, about going in a Balmain push organised Ironman run from Sydney to Wollongong and meeting Henry Lawson at one stage and seeing him washed under the waves and being given a bottle by him like a baton that he was passing on to me. But I didn't write that one down and I forgot it. If you believed in dreams and horoscopes and things like that as telling your fortune, then it was a rather dire dream to have, except that I succeeded in the Ironman race, got to Wollongong, got the blazer. I think the dream originated in the way those Balmain mob used to have a pub crawl every year. And the motto of their association was revolution through popular culture. Long since, of course, happily died out. There'd be a winery tour now, or a bistro crawl.
What Lawson was doing, of course, was a revolution through popular culture in a sense too, in his own time.
Oh, I don't know about that.
He went to London too.
He went to London. He didn't like it very much. There's a Lawson poem about the lights of London, I think. But I think he went there with the hopes of making a literary career there, which I didn't.
Well, that's interesting because the generations of Australians before you did. Peter Porter, David Malouf, they went to London in the hopes of making a literary career there, and one or two of them have done, Clive James and Porter, for example.
Mm-hmm. Would you call Clive James's career a literary career?
I think he would like to think it was related to literature. He writes books of poems and has them printed and so forth. He's written 2 books of autobiography that are very literate.
Oh, they're very funny too.
These days, of course, Australians might just as well go to New York to make a literary career, but they don't seem to do that either.
Perhaps they go to Sydney. Well stay at home.
Michael Dransfield wrote a lot of poems about Europe. I think Michael Dransfield had an idea of Europe, so that was where real culture came from. Although he was very ambiguous about that too. At the same time, he despised poets who just dropped a Greek god into their poem in the hope of making it more resonant. His attitude to high culture was a very ambiguous one. He was a boy from the middle-class suburbs who wanted more out of life, and that meant more culture, and he didn't know quite which way to turn to get it. One way he turned was to drugs, of course, and the romantic...
Culture through drugs.
Culture through drugs. The romantic myth-making facility that drugs gave you. And I think it's fair to say that he romanticised drug taking and the role of the poet as a drug taker and a seer. You've had something to say about that in a poem called Speed, a Pastoral. Would you like to read that?
Yeah, I will. Speed, a Pastoral. It's fun to take speed and stay up all night, not writing those reams of poetry just thinking about is bad for you. Instead, your feelings follow your career down the drain and find they like it there, among an anthology of fine ideas, bound together by a chemical in your blood that lets you stare the TV in its vacant face and cheer, consuming yourself like a mortgage. And when Keats comes to dine, or Flaubert, you can answer their purities with your own less negative ones. For example, you know Dransfield's line that once you become a junkie, you'll never want to be anything else. Well, I think he died too soon, as if he thought drugs were an old-fashioned teacher and he was the teacher's pet, who just put up his hand and said quietly, "Sir, sir," and heroin let him leave the room.
That phrase, "I think he died too soon," what does that really mean inside the poem?
Well, inside and outside. In a sense, it suggests that Dransfield took the easy way out, that it's almost as if he sacrificed himself to his own myth, and that was a sort of easy thing to do. It might sound odd to say that it was easy to die of consumption or whatever it was brought on by malnutrition and massive physical neglect, but it was as if his poetry led up to his death, like looking back at it. He's like, and certainly he was retreated, like a figure from literary myth. You know, Dransfield at 45 is an interesting idea, but he almost made certain that it never happened.
The poems of Dransfield seem very old-fashioned now in the way that some of the poems in that period don't quite seem old-fashioned. I think he was old-fashioned even while he was writing them, or
he was
before
certainly very romantic in a sort of high-class television series way, but his good poems still survive. Geography or After Vietnam, I think, are full-bore romantic poems, but they're terrific. They work really well.
He hardly ever revised anything he wrote, I gather. I mean, I knew him very vaguely, and it seemed to me that he never did want to revise things because he had too many more to write that day. And he was proud of the idea of dashing off a poem in 15 minutes, and that was that, hot from the hotbed of inspiration.
Lucky man.
You don't do that?
Oh, well, I would like to write a lot more poems than I do. I feel vaguely guilty about not producing more. I mean, I would like to write more.
Well, also, I think there's a matter of quality as well as a matter of quantity.
Oh, sure, but
people have said you rewrite and rewrite your work and refine it down to its very essentials.
Well, not all my poems I rewrite a lot. Say that poem I just read, that would have gone through about, say a dozen to 15 drafts, something like that, and that'd be about the average. And I think it's worth doing till you get something right. I mean, I've had the experience a few times of writing something, thinking, wacko, putting it in the mail, sending it off, and then seeing it in a magazine and realising that the thing's flawed, but there's a potentially good poem there that needs work on. And you feel a bit silly doing that. Other times I just have to do a lot of drafts to get the thing to work.
Do you know what you wanted to say in the early stages? Do you know what you're going to have to redraft it to look like?
No, not at all. I mean, I just know that it's not working, that there's something wrong with it.
I think a lot of people think poets have an idea, and then they sit down and write the poem that illustrates that idea, and all they have to do is to get it to fit properly, and it's a good poem.
They're half right, but it's not an idea that you have. It's a form that suggests itself to you. And I mean, I often find that if I get the form of the thing right, the rest will follow. And sometimes I'll have the beginnings of a poem and it won't be working, and because I'll try to put it in the wrong form. But once the form suggests itself, the poem follows. But this only happens in the lines on the page as you're working. It's not you think, oh, should this be a sestina or a sonnet? No, it should be an epic or something, and then you get it right. It's more that it's almost like it's saying to you, make us into 2-line stanzas, about seven 2-line stanzas, and then we'll work properly. And there's suggestion from not literally, dear listener, not literally. There's a suggestion. This is how it's going to work, and then if you get it right, it does.
It's a sort of adjustment thing then. You begin with an idea of your own, and then as you start to write, the poem begins to suggest how you can adjust that.
What I usually begin with is a line or a phrase or a phrase that suggests an idea. No, it doesn't suggest an idea. It just suggests some more lines. When the material you're working with isn't suggesting anything, and it's very depressing because you can keep working at it, but nothing. Basically, I suppose it's a romantic idea of inspiration. I mean, I don't believe in romantic inspiration, so it annoys me that I don't have more control over the process. I very much admire Laurie Duggan for his ability to not write to order, but to write almost like the way Auden could write. Say, go away and write me a poem 50 lines long that mentions 16 different birds and 5 varieties of toothpaste and the weather in Jamaica and a cricket score, and he'll come back the next day if he had a mind to, and give you a poem with all these things in it. And it was a very good poem too. I'm not saying Auden wrote that way, but he certainly
could.
He seemed to have that facility.
Yes, he convinced you that he could do it if he had to. John, one of the Australian writers who's gone to Europe and come back to Australia and then gone to Europe again is David Malouf. His An Imaginary Life talks about, in an imaginary way, the Latin poet Ovid and the idea of metamorphosis and change. David writes that from a very Euro-centred view of the universe. You've written a poem called The Age of Plastic, which looks at Ovid from a very Australian perspective.
Well, I'm not sure about that. I mean, the poem got its Ovidian or mock Ovidian title following the Age of Gold, the Age of Silver, the Age of Iron, which Ovid thought he was living in. Things couldn't be much worse, he thought. And the Age of Plastic is the title I gave it, and I said after Ovid, mainly because the Scripsy editors have been at me for ages to do some translations, because they're at everyone to translate Latin poets. It's almost as if they've apportioned the Latin poets to various Australian poets. Laurie Duggan does Marshall, John Scott does Ovid. I think they had me lined up for Tibullus because they thought there was similar hysterical elements.
Would you like to read it?
Oh, okay, yeah.
The Age of Plastic.
The Age of Plastic. The dictionary definition of change means your face looks different in the water. And even though you'd feel at home down there, each moment spent at one remove, anywhere between the mammal and the sponge, you know you'd miss a particular cassette, idle tears or a glass of gin, and be irked by the serious options a changeless life presents. For example, minor poet, conspicuously dishonest, would look funny on a plaque screwed to a tree, while the blue trace of your former life suggests an exception generations will end up chanting. For them, the parts of speech will need explaining, not lakes or sleep or sex, or the dumb poets of the past who, being lyrical, missed out on this.
John, that poem has a quotation in it, or is it a misquotation?
Well, it's a misquotation from English poet Basil Bunting. He said what he wanted on his tombstone, and I presume he has now. It was minor poet, not conspicuously dishonest. And I thought this was a flagrantly arrogant thing to have. If I had a similar quote on my tombstone, it would be minor poet, conspicuously dishonest, see first line. But the point of it in the poem is to suggest what the future is going to be like in relation to oneself. That is, that people are remembered for the quirks of their grammar rather than for their personalities. That's what the lines, while the blue trace of your former life suggests an exception generations will end up chanting, is that your work will be known for its location of a particular grammatical formation rather than for the story of your life.
I was thinking the blue trace, the plaque, and the quote from a dead poet all linked together into one image of those blue plaques that you have pinned to buildings where dead poets live.
I hadn't thought of that. Certainly, there's a possibility.
Let's look at another poem, Watching the Treasurer.
Yeah, well, this poem's more about television than it is about the treasurer, but the two things are sort of inseparable, really. Watching the Treasurer. I want to believe the beautiful lies the past spreads out like a feast. Television is full of them, and inside their beauty you can act. Paul Keating's bottom lip trembles, then recovers, like the exchange rate under pressure, buoyed up as the words come out. Elegant apostle of necessity, meaning what rich Americans want. His world is like a poem, completing that utopia no philosopher could argue with, where what seems is, and what your words describe you know exists, under a few millimetres of invisible cosmetic, bathed in a milky white fluorescent glow.
A lot of your poems seem to deal with solipsism as a philosophical position inside literature. It interests me that I've just realised that that's just what that poem is doing.
Well,
solipsism through the media. A lot of your poems talk about philosophy too. You did a fine arts degree, didn't you?
I did fine arts at uni for a couple of years. I did my honours in English.
It seems that that's all about applying philosophy to art, isn't it? Fine arts.
When I did it, it was much more art historical in a rather under-theorised way.
There's another poem that does something the same sort of thing for me, and we might like to look at that one now.
Missing Persons. The planets line up and nothing happens beneath the sheltering bowl of your don't have a clue feelings as the day goes to pieces and you disappear. Equally indulgent but almost on schedule, in the next life I am Ike and you are Tina Turner, vibrating between box speakers on a shelf. Next to me is a water ball with snow falling on Sydney Harbour. Why not invent a roll of 20s and 50s held together by a white elastic band? You know nothing can keep us apart.
Yes, I've always worried about the way that last line just occurs, apparently without any logical development from the rest of the poem. How do you see it emerging from the poem?
I think it's like a mystic wedding.
Ike and Tina Turner.
Yeah, and...
Well, I guess what I'm really saying is why...
Do you know what a water ball is?
Yes, it's
one of those things with snow in that you shake up.
Well, it's the incongruity of snow on Sydney Harbour, which is very nice.
Mm.
I guess what I'm really talking about is the fact that what's a fairly coherent theme through it is interrupted by the phrase, why not invent a roll of 20s and 50s held together by a white elastic band? Somehow that just appears. I mean, why not? But
well, the white elastic band's like the snow. I think it's suggesting that the events celebrated in the first part of the poem, or the events looked for in the first part of the poem, are as unlikely as snow on Sydney Harbour or a roll of 20s and 50s held together by a white elastic band.
If you're going to do one, you might as well do the lot.
That if these things happen, then nothing can keep us apart.
If pigs fly.
Well, 20s and 50s held together by a white elastic band. I mean, yes, that's the idea. It's I'm rather proud of that poem. I think it's one of the best ones I've written for the last 5, 10 years, 6 years, something like that.
It has a certain self-containedness about it. I think perhaps that bowl that appears in the first part of the poem and then reappears again as a water ball.
Yeah, simple, isn't it?
Both of them contain an imitation of the sky as a bowl that contains the whole world.
Yeah, childish when you look at it.
I wouldn't say that.
Seemed the right title for the poem. It's sort of a poem about negation and loss, I guess. But I'm not entirely certain why the title. I can't remember why. It seems the appropriate title for it.
Let's look at one of your more romantic poems, John, Lullaby.
Well, romantic, wimpy perhaps, I don't know. Okay, romantic. Lullaby. The sun tries to go down and the moon floats near my elbow. I wish I lived where night falls suddenly and the stars look like bits of paint scraped off a window. Instead, I sleep in the bed of a great man, myself, too tired to cover up the balanced odalisque of feeling crashed out beside me on the cushions in the back of a revving panel van. I hope I don't wake up this alert or as black as you paint my childish heart.
I don't think of that as a romantic poem.
Well, it's a sort of, yes, I suppose it is, desperate emotional longing for the balanced odalisque of feeling.
It's interesting that the female figure in the poem, he said, sounded like an English lecturer, is removed from any normal human adjective-noun combinations. It's not a girl or a woman or a painting or a photograph or an object of art.
Well, yes, I mean, that's what the poem's about. There's no one there except the imagination of somebody there. You're imagining a form rather than a person because there's no person there.
I think that's what's nice about it. It's a poem with a big hole in the middle of it, and the reader fills the hole in with his own imagination of what might be there in his own experience of life. You're allowing the reader room to recreate an image in the middle of the poem that will hold it all together for him or her. So let's look at Monkey's Pride.
Monkey's Pride. Not the shouted poetry of well-travelled sandwich fillings, but the shorter, more carnal lyric that singes the page, like a packet of bungers facing Mecca with lust in their hearts, hearts that resemble Steve Kellen's face or Gig Ryan's inscribed on a banana, a whole bunch of them, each with a different face, suitable for various occasions, and not bananas either, but a bunch of grapes made of glass, a tribute to the glassblower's art. But while we recognise the faces of the great, the big ones at the top of the bunch, the ones in the middle are blurred because the hot glass was further away from the artist's controlled breathing, while at the bottom of the bunch we have to read ourselves into the vaguely sketched features. Though I can see myself okay, as the light, refracted through the face of the one I am, shows a glazed somnolence I'd recognise anywhere, and the smashed forepaw of Elsa the lioness held out towards me with a reproachful look. Not me, not my good intentions, the full rounded lips on the grape seem to say, even though digressions appear like tree-lined avenues, because I am a balloon that floats around, bumping into the suburbs, where a cowboy appears from a bookcase riding on a bottle of pills. Soon, the grape goes on, new technology will detach me, and I'll be employed on a rowing boat mounted in a park, the one the avenues lead to, because society has elected me to decorate its falling apart with a useless panache. And I will, despite my vocation to become a labour-saving device, opening cans by remote control in the kitchen of your heart, bottling the vegetables you grow in your own backyard.
Well, there's something special about that poem, I think.
Something special? Yes, it's a sort of manifesto, isn't it?
Towards the end there, where the grape addresses us and discusses his vocation, it seems to me the idea of decorating society's falling apart is in some ways the role that's left for the poet in the last quarter of the 20th century. It's a very complicated poem. And yet what I like about it is the way it moves forward in layers. One layer appears and then another layer slides out from underneath that and then another layer slides out from underneath that, which gives it a sliding forward movement that I think...
Yes, but it seems to do so by sort of willful disregarding of what it said up to one point. And not bananas either, but a bunch of grapes. And then go on and elaborate the grapes, and the grapes take over the poem.
Well, in a way, it's like watching a poet write a poem as well as just being able to read it as it moves forward. It's like watching somebody construct an object and think, well, no, we won't have that over there, we'll have it over here. And each change that's made improves the object's functionability until it begins to move off of its own accord, which is where the grape begins to speak. What do you like about it? Why do you feel it works well where it works?
I like the way, well, I think probably what you said before, the fact that it goes on, whereas it should sort of...
It should fail because it constructs itself sketch by sketch rather than on a firm
something
scaffolding.
like that. And I find it very difficult to write poems that are scattered over the page because most poetry that's scattered over the page seems to be only arbitrarily scattered over the page. But in this poem, it seems to need to be in the form that it is. Again, it's something about the form that sort of worked. Clusters of images connected by a speaking voice. And I think it's because that speaking voice is the thing that allows it to get away with making predictions about the future and society and everything.
Yes, the voice has been deauthorised in a very peculiar way and then reauthorised again, hasn't it? And yet, because that's so well achieved, then we're prepared to listen to it, I guess.
I hope so.
We just can't see the line breaks that you have on the page, so artfully arranged when we hear it on radio.
The line breaks are what makes it, I think. What it says, I think, is just the usual thing that anyone would say, as it says, elected to decorate it, spoiling apart with a useless panache, and I will, despite my vocation to become a labour-saving device, opening cans by remote control in the kitchen of your heart, bottling the vegetables you grow in your own backyard. It's a claim to emotional authenticity and to have the power to affect these feelings in other people.
And yet that's achieved by a claim to be useless and to demand the right to be useless. In fact,
demanding the right to be useless.
I think Auden said poetry makes nothing happen.
That's right. No art makes anything happen in particular. It's just enjoyable. It's a sort of boast poem, I suppose, or a manifesto. It got its name from the name of a horse that was running in a race that was printed on the newspaper underneath the pad I was writing it on. And it seemed like a good name.
That's wonderful. I was going to ask you where the name came from. I thought it might have come from the bananas, but I guess the bananas came from the monkey.
Well, I didn't see that. I was writing it in the kitchen in Petersham where I was living at the time, which must have been 1981, 82 maybe. I had a pad and I was writing it because I did this mostly all in one go. This probably would have been about 3 or 4 drafts of this poem. I couldn't think of a name and I moved the pad. And there was a list of horses running in a race, like the 6th at Randwick or something. And one of them was Monkey's Pride, and it just seemed right.
Was that after you'd written the poem? Or
yeah, after I'd written the poem.
After you'd written the poem, so the bananas were there first.
Oh, yeah.
And that's perhaps what connected you with the monkey.
I suppose so, yes. Monkeys eat bananas, don't they?
I thought I'd talk about something very basic from the average listener's point of view, I think. When you started thinking of yourself as a poet and when you started to write poetry, what did you think it would all mean? What did you see your life stretching before you like? Like a young lawyer who goes into a law office and says, one day I'll be a senior partner in the firm, or...
Well, I didn't start thinking of myself as a poet. I thought of myself as a person who wrote poems, hopefully good ones, because I was very antagonistic to the romantic personality type poetry of which there was a lot around, or at least it was a dominant image of the poet in sort of 1968, 1969, though I started writing in 1966. How did I see my life?
I suppose what I mean is, what value did you see your writing having in your life? Was it just a thing you might do on weekends, or was it a vocation?
No, oddly enough, it was rather like a vocation. I decided when I was about 14 I wanted to be a poet. And I structured a lot of my life around that decision. But I didn't see poetry as a career in the same way lawyers had careers, because obviously there were no poets on the 8:10 train to town.
There were no grants in those days either for poets, were there?
Well, no. But even with the system of grants that we've got now, it's still not a way of making a living. I thought for a while of being an academic. In fact, I was sort of thought well, I can always be an academic. This is because I went to university in the early 70s when the university system was still expanding. But I decided about 1977 that I didn't want to be an academic. After I'd been working on an MA for a while, I gave it away. But it wasn't so much the MA, it wasn't that side of academia I didn't like. I didn't like the sort of elite of the public service side of it, which is the most important aspect of it.
Well, that's how you get promotions, by handling that aspect of it, I think.
Mm.
And it occupies a great deal of people's time.
Also, struck me quite early on that there was a number of Australian poets who were academics whose work I thought was pretty terrible, and that they were trying to do two jobs at once. Because academia, because it's got so much more obvious career rewards in power and money and things like that, would tend to take over people's lives, and their poetry becomes more marginalised, and I think it shows in their work. No names, no pectoral.
I was just going to say, do you have anyone in mind there? But we won't push that one.
Well, I mean, it's not worth... Anyone who's interested in it knows the sort of poetry I mean.
Sure, but then you have to make a living, and as you say, you can't expect to do that forever from grant. That they just don't work that way. You have to have some kind of a job to make a living from. But what do you do for a living?
Well, I've done a number of things, all of them fairly deadbeat. Well, I don't mean deadbeat in a romantic sense, but sort of dead-end jobs. Last 5 years, on and off, I've moved furniture, worked for a furniture removalist. I've had a couple of periods of working in universities, one at the Institute teaching creative writing and one just recently at Macquarie teaching Australian literature. But they're the sort of academic equivalent of dead-end jobs because they're just 13-week contracts. Next year I'd like to be a writer-in-residence somewhere, and I'm going to apply to all the places that have them. Though I say this every year and I never get around to doing it. I suppose I'd have to say that my major form of income support has been unemployment benefit and then moving furniture now and again.
What do you think the ideal job would be for a poet? I think Auden said that one of the best jobs a poet could have would be translating poetry, I guess he meant, because you're in contact with words all the time and yet you don't have to use up your own creative energies too much while you're doing it. It leaves you energies to spare to write your own stuff.
I can think of a poet who's got a job almost like that and it hasn't done his work too much good. A friend of mine who works at SBS.
I've worked there for a while too, and I think it's an ideal job for a poet, except that you have to work too hard and you end up completely drained at the end of the week and not much energy left to write your poem.
Well, that's the beauty of furniture removing. I mean, it's a physical job. You don't have to think and you don't have any responsibility. You don't have to interact with people, just wardrobes. And it leaves you undrained, in fact, pent up. Though sometimes I'm too tired to bother doing anything after work. It doesn't call on your creative faculties such as they are.
One of the things that interests me about Australian poetry over the last 20 years is the way it's interacted with English poetry, with European poetry and with American poetry. It's done each of those things in a different way. How do you see those relationships as being important to what you're writing?
Well, with American poetry, I began by, and I still do, admire a number of American poets very much, despite the fact they're Americans, rather than because they are Americans. And I think they've written some of the best poems that have been written in English in the last 20 years. With English poetry, I haven't had a great deal of interaction. There's certain English poets, like, well, poets of the past, of course. English poets of the past, I think, are pretty terrific, most of them. Contemporary English poets, I haven't really had much effect on me one way or the other. I can see that a lot of them are skillful, but it's a sort of skill that I don't have and wouldn't wish to have because it's all conscious. I mean, it just knocks me out that at the end of Empson's collected poems, there's a 15 or so pages of notes explaining what all the images mean. I just don't work like that and find it rather funny. I mean, Geoffrey Hill, who's a very good poet, works in exactly the same way. European poetry, well, admiration for a number of European poets, so like Yanis Ritsos or Charcoal, more distant. Well, Charcoal's fairly distant. I say that because he's somebody I only discovered in the last couple of years. Ritsos sort of inspired me to try and write more plainly, write less decoratively.
Is that perhaps only the effect of the English translation?
Well, this is the problem,
yes,
isn't it?
It's a problem always, yes.
Though Martin Johnson, who knows Greek very well, says the translations of Ritsos are very good.
He's a fairly political writer, isn't he, in lots of ways, Ritsos?
Yes,
Not overtly, but underneath what he's saying is a clear line there.
Yeah, well, he's a very important political person in Greece. It was one of his poems, Romosini, was sort of the anthem of the people protesting against the junta in 1974. He went from being a rather vaguely symbolist, archetypal type poet to being a very clear, precise, but still non-denotative poet after he was tortured and imprisoned for a couple of years. It made me feel there's a lot of people whose style would probably benefit from the same experience. I was very knocked out by a group of his poems that I read in English translation in 1974, 75. And while I've still written some other poems that are much more decorative, and I'm quite proud of them, I wanted to get a sort of a style that drew attention to itself by not drawing attention to itself, that was overtly very plain but very powerful. One reason I'm very pleased with that poem, Missing Persons, is that it seems to do that without making a fuss about its own effects, but at the same time not pretending just to be plain speech or anything like that. Having all the force of the sort of poetry I admired very much when I started off, which was like early John Ashbery, but not having the same overtly artistic surface to it. So that's Europe, England, America.
Well, the relationship with America is a very difficult one because overlaying all of the interest any individual poet here might have for an individual poet in America is the pervasive problem of American cultural imperialism, the Coca-Cola culture, and the fact that it's such an active thing and it's supported so strongly with so many American dollars.
In some ways, it's not that pervasive because it is so pervasive on the level of popular culture. They don't feel the need to bombard us with their high culture. You know, get them by the coke ad and the rest will follow, sort of thing.
But what about the sort of remarks you hear occasionally about Australian poetry that's clearly responding to an American influence of some kind, that, it's just trying to imitate New York writers and be flashy and achieve success by doing that?
The way to be successful in Australian poetry is to imitate European writers and make a great fuss about how deep you are. Mostly people who say that usually haven't read the poets they're talking about. And even if it was the case, so what? I mean, the more New York poetry of the 1960s becomes distance from us, the more specific it seems to that time and place in a whole lot of ways. The influence it had on Australian poetry was rather more general. And you can see it in Alan Wern as much as in me or Gig Ryan or Chris Burns. Wern's Night Markets owes a lot to Coke's comic epics in inspiration. And there's some Berrigan around the edges of it too. Certainly, yeah.
And that's true of John Scott as well. I think Berrigan's, although the influence is not so clear, I think there's a lot of Berrigan behind some of his mid-period writing.
Yeah, well, the first person I got a book of Ted Berrigan's from was John Scott. He had many happy returns, so I photostated it.
What about the problem that Australia is a provincial culture? I mean, this is tied in with the other issue of American cultural imperialism. It's particularly true in the art world, where you simply cannot be heard anywhere in the world unless you can prove that you know all about what's happening in America this year. It's not as strongly there in poetry, but I think to some extent it's partly there.
I'm not sure that's actually true of the art world. It's true of the art world's rhetoric. poetry doesn't have the same commercial impetus behind it that visual arts does.
That's true.
And the provinciality of Australian poetry always has to be seen in relation to a centre. The whole business of province and metropolis is not as important as people make out, because where it occurs is at the level of reputation rather than at the level of technique as a way of presenting yourself. If you're not worried about the metropolis, it won't. You can't avoid it on one level. On another level, you can avoid it very easily. It's only when you have to take a stand in relation to it that it has a big effect on your work. I mean, Les Murray's a good example of somebody whose work's all predicated on an implicit awareness of a metropolitan centre of which he is in revolt or objecting to or standing against. But if you're not affected by that arrangement, then it doesn't really matter. It matters on the level of fame, power, success and money to a certain extent, because Australian culture is very much predicated around a belief in that metropole-provincial distinction, and there's no better way of succeeding in Australia than succeeding overseas. But it's not important. It never has been very important to me because, A, I don't think my work could be successfully read as an emanation of a New York style or any other style. Certainly there was influences there when I started off, but the reason for that was there was nothing in Australia that impressed me one iota.
Well, I think that's true for a lot of Australian writers, and what they do with that is their own responsibility. I don't think there are many Australian writers at all of any persuasion who say, I follow R.D. Fitzgerald's line or James McCord's line. So they all have to look elsewhere for influences if they admit that they have any influences at all.
You never know, Tranter. There might be a whole lot of people thinking, I wish I could write like John Tranter.
Or John Forbes. Or Les Murray.
Yeah, well, I mean, you can see Les's influence very widely in a lot of people starting off writing, or it tends to dissipate as they get older, but in some writers it's very much there. I mean, not so much his tone, but his concerns and his way of presenting experience.
Yes, I wonder if that's a useful influence on their work as they develop.
I don't know. I really don't.
Certainly can't do much more harm than John Ashbery as an early influence on a writer. I think Ashbery can be terribly confusing for a young person to come up against.
I wasn't harmed by John Ashbery because I didn't really understand him enough. I knew his poems were marvellous in the main. And the thing that I liked about Ashbery was that there wasn't any personality there.
Well, he'd achieved what Eliot was after, which is the removal of the personality.
Without even, well, it's not so much but in Eliot it's a sort of, admire my minimal personality, I've removed it.
A big fuss is made of it,
Yeah, in Ashbery it's like the personality is not it's not that there's no personality there, but it's not a problem. There's not that desire to present the image of the author.
Or to hide it,
and I mean, that's what O'Hara is very good at. I mean, that's why stupid people read O'Hara as a ultimate chatterer. And he's not that at all. He uses the chat because the personality is not a problem one way or the other, neither necessary nor not necessary. He can just put in what he wants. But his aim is just the same as Ashbery, just using completely different technique.
To be released in March next year by the Sydney publishers Hale and Iremonger. His other books include Tropical Skiing and Stalin's Holidays, though they're almost rare books by now and hard to find. His work is widely represented, though, in the anthology The New Australian Poetry, published by Makar Press in Brisbane and available from good bookstores. Well, that brings us nearly to the end of another Radio Helicon. In a few minutes, the 10 o'clock news. But before I go, I'd like to tell you something about next Sunday's program. we'll be bringing you the second and final part of John Archer's feature on Australian domestic architecture, Building a Nation. Next Sunday, he looks at the architecture of federation and at Australia's fondness for the red brick suburb, through to the houses and buildings that surround us today. Also, next week, the first of a three-part series of programs consisting of poems, reminiscence and music by Australian poet Peter Porter. He's called it In Exile, an anti-biographical autobiography. I do not know who I am, he says. I have poor recall of what has happened to me. I have been in exile from myself all my life. But I am part of a world nexus which is extraordinary, just as you are. A given, not a chosen domain. That's In Exile, an anti-biographical autobiography by the poet Peter Porter, next Sunday evening at 8 o'clock.